All right, now what we're going to do now is we're going to step through the major endocrine glands of the body. We're going to talk about the major hormones they produce and the effect that they have. We're going to start with the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is super important. This guy is located just underneath the hypothalamus. As a review, I'll draw over here. So remember the brainstem, you know, the lateral view of the brainstem, we've drawn this like 100 times. But I'll draw it again really quick. You're gonna have the midbrain, you got the pons, and you have the medulla. It kind of comes down like this. Then you got your good old thalamus, okay, like that. Look at this guy. Your midbrain kind of comes up like this, like that. Then underneath that thalamus, you're gonna have the hypothalamus. It's right underneath it, and then you'll have the epithalamus. That good old pituitary extends downward from the hypothalamus, like that. Okay. And if I were to label this guy is the pituitary. That blue hole, or blue structure. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on that little area, and we're going to draw a little bit bigger. We're going to zoom in right where the hypothalamus meets the pituitary. I'll use the same color scheme. So we'll have hypothalamus there, and then we'll have the pituitary right here. The pituitary has two parts. It has the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So I'm going to abbreviate this. Anterior pituitary is on this side, and then posterior pituitary is on that side. And this is the hypothalamus. Everybody go with that? Now, we'll start with the posterior pituitary, and we'll talk about how these hormones get released. This pituitary has a special kind of unique relationship with the hypothalamus, and it's unlike other endocrine glands. What we'll have is we have a series of neurons. The cell bodies for these neurons are hanging out in the hypothalamus. The axons for these neurons are super long, and they stretch all the way down into the posterior pituitary, like that. At the base of those axons, so the axon terminal, you're going to have a capillary bed in this posterior pituitary. Now, a capillary bed, we haven't talked about vessels yet, but basically, you have all these tubes in our body that carry blood, and the blood needs to get to the tissues. When the blood gets to the tissues, where, the tissues that need oxygen and they need glucose, these vessels get smaller and smaller and smaller until they get so small that they are the smallest vessels in the body. Those are called capillaries. Capillaries allow all the good stuff from the blood to leak out of the capillaries so that the tissues can have access to it, like oxygen, glucose. And at the same time, those capillaries are going to pick up waste products like CO2, nitrogenous waste, things that the cell doesn't need anymore. The site of exchange between the blood and the tissues occurs at capillaries. So we're going to have this vessel that comes into the pituitary like this. When it gets to the pituitary, we got blood coming in this direction. It's going to split up into these tiny little capillaries that look like this. These tiny little capillaries, tiny little vessels that allow exchange, things to come in and out of the blood. And then it comes back together into a vessel that leaves. Remember how most neurons, they release neurotransmitters in their axon terminal? Okay. Well, those neurotransmitters are actually produced in the cell body of all neurons. And I didn't mention this because it wasn't really important at the time, but what these neurons do is they'll produce all those acetylcholine molecules or whatever neurotransmitter we're talking about in the cell body, those neurotransmitters actually migrate down that long axon where they're stored in vesicles in the axon terminal. Okay, so the cell bodies make them, they have to migrate to the axon terminal. These neurons are unique because they don't produce neurotransmitters, they actually produce hormones. So this neuron is producing all these hormones that are going to migrate down the axon, and they collect in vesicles in that axon terminal. When that neuron fires, what do you think happens to those hormones? They get released right into that capillary bed. And due to diffusion, they're going to diffuse right into the blood in those capillaries because there's no hormones in there, right? Diffusion, high to low concentration. So this neuron fires, these hormones get released, and they get picked up by the capillaries, and now they're in the bloodstream, and that takes them to the rest of the body. This is why the pituitary is called a neuroendocrine gland, because it's like half neuron, half endocrine. It's a neuron that produces hormones. There's two different hormones that are released out of the posterior pituitary. The first hormone is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is released. The receptors for oxytocin in females are in the walls of the uterus. And I even gave this example already in A&P1. The receptors for oxytocin are in the female uterus. When it finds the uterus, well, not finds, but when it passes by the uterus, it binds onto those receptors. That triggers the uterus to contract. And this is important for labor. This is what initiates labor. The stimulus for the release of oxytocin are stretch receptors in the walls of the uterus. So as that baby grows and grows and grows, and as it reaches like full-term size, it'll start stimulating those stretch receptors in the walls of the uterus, telling the brain, well, like, this is really big. The hypothalamus, it receives that signal, and that hypothalamus releases oxytocin out of the posterior pituitary. That oxytocin binds onto the uterus, tells it to contract. That's the start of labor. Okay? As it starts to contract, it's going to stretch those receptors even more, which triggers more oxytocin to be released. And this, you got a positive feedback loop. A lot of times, women, they'll get induced, like induced labor. So they'll give them like a synthetic form, a very similar form of this hormone called Pitocin, is one example. And that kickstarts the process because you release Pitocin, it's going to bind onto those receptors, cause contractions, which stimulate the stretch receptors, which then causes more, oxytocin to be released, which just starts that positive feedback loop. Oxytocin is also involved in the ejection of breast milk from during breastfeeding. Not the production of breast milk, but the ejection of breast milk during lactation. In males, obviously, those roles don't exist. But in males, it's called the love hormone. And so it's active during romantic times. It's supposed to be the hormone that's associated with the feeling of love, right? And like trust towards your significant other. Like they say that when you're cuddling your significant other, oxytocin is released. It builds that feeling of trust and love or whatever. It's called the love hormone. Another hormone that gets released from the posterior pituitary is ADH, which stands for anti-diuretic hormone. Diuretic, it's all about urine production in the kidneys, okay? So ADH, when it's released, it has receptors in the tubes of the kidneys, and it tells those kidneys to produce a very tiny amount of concentrated urine. So in other words, it tells the kidneys to hold on to body fluids. When do you think ADH is going to be released? When you're dehydrated or overhydrated? Dehydrated, right? When you're dehydrated and ADH gets released, and that's going to tell your kidneys, be like, hey, why don't you hold on to as much water as possible because we're already dehydrated, right? The stimulus for the release of ADH in the hypothalamus is low blood volume. Okay, so if we are really dehydrated, we're going to have not a lot of fluid in our body, low blood volume, low blood pressure, because that goes along with low blood volume, and increased concentration of salts in your blood. So if your blood's like very salty, that means there's not a lot of fluid in there. We need to hold on to that urine. So one important kind of connection in this class, especially when we get into the cardiovascular system, is the connection between blood volume and blood pressure. Think about this. Let me just ask you, guess. If blood volume goes up, more blood in your body, what happens to blood pressure, up or down? Up, okay? This is intuitive because think of your cardiovascular system as just a system of balloons that hold fluid, tube-like balloons. If you cram more fluid into those balloons, pressure is going to go up. So if blood volume goes up, blood pressure goes up. If blood volume goes down, blood pressure goes down. So a low blood pressure is a good indication, is a good stimulus to release ADH. Alcohol inhibits the release of ADH. So that's one reason why alcohol leads to dehydration, because your body, might need to release some ADH because you're not overly hydrated. If you, after a couple of drinks, that alcohol is going to prevent your posterior pituitary from releasing that. So your body just produces tons of urine when it shouldn't, right? Your body should be releasing ADH, but it's not. And that contributes to the dehydration due to alcohol consumption. An injury to the head can sometimes damage the hypothalamus and cause a decrease in the amount of ADH that's released, okay? And this is called hyposecretion of ADH. So there's a decrease in the amount of ADH that's released. What do you think the symptoms of that person would be? Head injury that causes damage to the hypothalamus, not enough ADH is secreted.
Dehydration, not being able to hold the bladder.
Yes, that's it. They are going to the bathroom all the time. They are producing tons of urine when they shouldn't. Dehydration, and it causes an extreme urge to drink, like extreme thirst. So those folks will just always feel so ravished for fluid, and they'll just drink, and they'll pee. Yeah. Folks that have a tumor sometimes in their hypothalamus, right? Or maybe like a stroke or a tumor, they can, a tumor, not a stroke. They can have a hypersecretion of ADH, okay? So that could be a problem too. Their hypothalamus just goes crazy, releases ADH all the time. What do you think those symptoms would be? Yes, like extreme edema. So you've got like extreme swelling all over your body, coupled with weight gain, because you're holding on to way too much fluid. You need to pee, but your kidneys aren't producing enough urine, so it backs up in your body, which can be very problematic. Leads to, okay, well, let me ask you this: would that cause high blood pressure or low blood pressure? High, because blood volume is through the roof, right? Fluids are through the roof. High blood pressure, that could be problematic chronically because it puts a lot of stress on your arteries. Okay, cool. Anterior pituitary, these are the only two released by the posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary has a slightly different setup. You have some neuron cell bodies that are hanging out in the hypothalamus, but the axons, these guys aren't nearly as long. They extend down right to like the border between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Then what you have is you have a blood vessel that comes in like this. Alright. This guy is going to expand into a capillary bed up here. Then that capillary bed comes back together into a single vessel that travels down to the anterior pituitary, where it breaks into another capillary bed. And now it leaves the pituitary. So blood comes in like this, and it leaves like that. This situation where you have two capillary beds in sequence is rare in the body. We just don't have it a lot. Typically, you have one vessel that breaks into a capillary bed, goes together into a larger vessel that heads back to the heart. That's the typical arrangement. Whenever you do have two capillary beds in sequence like that, it's called a portal system. And the specific name of this portal system is called the hypophyseal portal system. So this is what happens. You've got some hormones. I'm going to draw these guys in this like brown color, I guess. So you got some hormones that are produced by the neurons in the hypothalamus. They travel down to the axon terminal of these first neurons. When these neurons fire, the hormones get released, right? They get released into this capillary bed, where they travel down to the anterior pituitary. Now there's something special going on in this anterior pituitary. You've got a collection of epithelial cells that are housed in the walls of these capillaries. So they're like little special cells that are hanging out, I'll draw them in this light blue, that are hanging out on the walls of these capillaries. These epithelial cells, and I'll label one of them, it's just an epithelial cell. These epithelial cells have a couple of jobs. First, they have receptors for this first set of brown hormones. These hormones bind onto those epithelial cells. These epithelial cells have also made a second set of hormones. I'll draw these second set of hormones in blue, just like I did over here. These epithelial cells, once they bind onto the brown hormones, they release the blue hormones, which then collect in the capillary bed and get taken to the rest of the body. See how these brown hormones, when they were released, they ultimately triggered the release of another hormone, like the brown ones triggered the release of the blue ones? Any hormone that triggers the release of another hormone is called a tropic hormone. So I'll label this as any hormone that triggers the release of another hormone is a tropic hormone. Is oxytocin a tropic hormone? No, because it just tells the uterus to do something. He doesn't tell another gland to release another hormone. Okay. How about ADH? Is he a tropic hormone? No, he just tells the kidneys to produce less urine. So he doesn't, that's what he does. There's quite a few hormones released by the anterior pituitary. We're going to focus on these blue ones. So the ones that ultimately get released, not the tropic hormones. Tropic hormones have their own set of names. We're not going to focus on those. We're going to focus on the ones that leave the anterior pituitary as a result of the tropic hormones. First one we'll talk about is growth hormone. What do you think that guy does? He tells you to grow. That's like one function of him. Okay, so when we are children and the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary is going to stimulate the growth of skeletal muscle, and it's also going to stimulate the growth of bones, so we get taller and we get bigger. After we reach full size, adult, like men in their early 20s, females in their like late teens, maybe 20 or so, our epiphyseal plates, they calcify. Okay, so we're not going to get any taller, right? Growth hormone is not going to cause us to get any taller. Athletes will sometimes take growth hormone as an adult to get a competitive edge because it is associated with muscle growth, like skeletal muscle growth. It does make your muscles grow. Problem is, it's also going to tell your bones to grow. But your bones can't grow longer. They're calcified, no matter how much growth hormone they get. What that causes is a condition called acromegaly. And this causes like unsymmetric and unproportional bone growth. It causes the face to be kind of weirdly shaped. Maybe the jaw gets bigger, like you'll have portions of the skull bones that grow. And that's a problem. That bone growth is irreversible. If there's an excess of growth hormone as a child, that causes gigantism. Right, like so Andre the Giant, right? I mean, he's just a very tall person. He had an excess of growth hormone due to dysfunctional posterior or anterior pituitary. You'll also notice that his face had a very unique shape. That was acromegaly, because there was a secretion of that growth hormone probably after his bones reached their full kind of normal size. Tumors can also cause acromegaly, like a tumor in the hypothalamus or that can cause a hypersecretion of growth hormone, which can lead to that acromegaly. So it's not just through supplements that causes acromegaly, it's just any type of excess of growth hormone in adulthood can cause that condition. A decrease or not enough growth hormone causes pituitary dwarfism. This is not like the dwarfism that you think about that's hereditary, where you have this unique proportion of the body. The symptoms of pituitary dwarfism in children is just delayed onset of puberty, small stature, right? Like low muscle mass, and easily fixed, just supplements the growth hormone, through childhood. That usually kickstarts puberty or helps to kickstart puberty, and then they can achieve adult size, and then they'll stop the supplements at adulthood. I don't want you guys to think that growth hormone is only associated with growth, though, in childhood, because as adults, we have levels of growth hormone that are constantly released by the anterior pituitary. They're just not in very high levels. The roles of growth hormone on a daily basis, it has a very strong metabolic role. So what it does is that every one of us has growth hormone flowing through our bodies right now. Yes, it's associated with the growth of muscles and this and that due to exercise, but its main role is to conserve glucose in the blood, right? So it's a glucose conserving hormone. It tells the body to use fats as fuel. It encourages the body to metabolize fats and proteins so we can save glucose. It also encourages the liver to well, we haven't gotten there yet. I'm not going to explain that yet. But it just encourages the metabolism of everything other than glucose so we can keep glucose levels high in the body. It encourages fat metabolism. It encourages the conversion of proteins to usable fuel so that we can keep glucose levels high in the blood. It's known as an antagonist to insulin because insulin does the exact opposite. It encourages cells to use glucose, which we'll talk about next time. All right, so that's growth hormone. Next up, we have prolactin. Prolactin is associated with lactation, so the production of breast milk in females. Oxytocin is associated with the ejection of breast milk during breastfeeding. Prolactin is the production of that breast milk. Next up, we have our two gonadotropic hormones. With a name like gonadotropic hormone, what do you think they do? Or female, right? Gonads, like male and female, right? So it deals with the reproductive system. Tropic hormones, so gonadotropic. What does tropic mean? They're going to stimulate the release of another hormone. So these hormones stimulate the release of other hormones in the gonads, in the male and female reproductive system. The two examples, one is FSH, that stands for follicle stimulating hormone. This is all about the maturation of the gametes, or the production of gametes. In females, FSH is going to tell the ovaries to release and mature the eggs, right? So the eggs are the gametes in females, so it's going to trigger the release and development of the eggs. In males, what do you think it does? What does it trigger? What process? The production of sperm, spermatogenesis. So FSH stimulates the production of gametes, eggs, and sperm. LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone, this guy is associated with the release of sex hormones. In females, it triggers the release of progesterone and estrogen. And in males, what does it trigger? the release of testosterone. So this brings up, like, it kind of shows how complicated the endocrine system is in some ways. Let's say you go home and your friend's like, oh, you're learning about the endocrine system? That's cool. Well, like, you know, I'm asking for a friend, but what causes the release of testosterone? And you're like, well, it's not a simple answer. You'd be like, well, first it starts, you have these little neurons in a tiny part of the brain called the hypothalamus. They're gonna release hormones into the capillary bed, which are going to travel down to the anterior pituitary. They bind on epithelial cells, which are then going to release another trophic hormone called luteinizing hormone. That guy travels all around the body, finally binds to Leydig cells in the testicles, which are going to trigger the release of testosterone. Okay. Now that whole system operates on a feedback loop, right? So when testosterone reaches an appropriate level in the body, when it's high enough, let's say it's a little higher than it should be, the hypothalamus goes, well, we got more testosterone than we need. What's it going to do to the production of those trophic hormones? Increase or decrease the secretion of them? More testosterone than you need. What are these neurons going to do? Release more or less of these brown hormones? Less, right? That's going to cause less of decreased secretion of LH, which is going to cause a decreased secretion of testosterone. So it all works on this like really complicated negative feedback loop to maintain testosterone levels. Things like anabolic steroids destroy this feedback loop. They just ransack it. So anabolic steroids is synthetic testosterone in a way. And essentially that's what it is. So if someone pumps their body full of synthetic testosterone, what's that going to do to your testosterone levels in the body? Raise them or lower them? Well, it's like ultimately, like initially, you're right. Like initially, it's just like synthetic testosterone. Your testosterone levels are through the roof. Okay, your hypothalamus is going to measure that and be like, wow, our testosterone is way too high. So these neurons up here are going to basically just shut down production of the trophic hormones. These guys don't receive any trophic hormones. They shut down the release of LH. The Leydig cells aren't receiving any type of stimulatory signal, so they stop the production of testosterone. You really just shut down your body's own ability to make testosterone. After a couple of weeks or months, if that person stops taking steroids, anabolic steroids, that feedback system can reboot itself and begin to start secreting testosterone again. But if someone chronically uses steroids, that system shuts down permanently. And so you basically eliminated the body's ability to produce your own testosterone. That's why anabolic steroids, chronic use, leads to sterility, because you need the production of testosterone for the production of sperm and just sexual behavior in general. And if that happens, you're on hormone replacement therapy. Like you have to take synthetic testosterone because your body can't do it. That's the only like risk of dealing with these negative feedback loops, is that if you start supplementing any type of level of any type of thing in your body, any type of hormone, then your body goes, sweet, I don't need to produce as much, which is the exact opposite of what you're trying to fix, you know, because there was probably a deficiency. You supplement it, your body goes, sweet, I can just produce even less. All right, another hormone that we have, super easy one, thyroid stimulating hormone. What do you think he does? You didn't study, you go one guess. He stimulates
It is
the
thyroid.
Right. Very easy. What more? ACTH. This stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. You forgot to study, let's say you missed this class, you show up at the test, and somebody's like, what does adrenocorticotropic hormone do? Based off his name, what do you think he does? Close. It's really good actually, but let's even more basic terms. Let's just break down the name. Adrenal gland. Okay, so you're close, right? Adrenal gland, right? Cortico. Do you think it stimulates the adrenal medulla or the adrenal cortex?
Cortex.
the adrenal cortex. There's two parts. The adrenal medulla releases adrenaline. The adrenal cortex releases things like cortisol, which we have to talk about, which we will next time. So it causes the adrenal cortex to do what? Tropic. What does tropic mean?
It triggers a release.
It triggers the adrenal cortex to release another hormone. And that's what he does. And we'll talk about that specific hormone. We're really talking about cortisol. So the adrenal cortex releases cortisol, and we'll talk about the function of cortisol next class. All right.